kind of me at 17, 18. And it was at this time that through a friend, I began to read Russian literature. And in a way, reading Russian literature, for me, it was also a kind of search, a spiritual search. And it's interesting that at the time, I really had no idea, almost that the Orthodox Church existed. But I read all the novels of Dostoevsky, and I found in them, obviously so much that was, Christian and rooted in this Christian worldview. And I think at the time I just kind of thought, oh, well, they're Christians too. I didn't even stop to think that, this was actually orthodoxy. So that was a very kind of, in many ways, my first introduction to orthodoxy, although it wasn't to any kind of, people who were living out orthodoxy today. Yeah. So anyway, shall I carry on, Ralph?
Yes, please carry on. It's lovely.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, that was kind of just before I went off to study at university. At university, because I was used to, the kind of Methodist Bible studies, I joined the United Reformed Church, which also perhaps had a kind of charismatic side to it. So it was kind of nonconformism with a bit of Pentecostalism thrown in, if you like, at that stage of my life. But also, I think university brought me into contact with many people of different church backgrounds. My closest friend had a Quaker background. I also had another close friend who attended Durham Cathedral, so that was a very kind of high church Anglican background. There was also a very active evangelical Anglican church, and I also had friends who went to the Catholic Church. So I think at that stage, although myself, even I remember somebody suggesting I should go to the evangelical Anglican service with them. And I remember at the time thinking, I'm just not used to, liturgy, vestments. That was what I associated with Anglicanism. And it was something that I knew nothing of and didn't feel at home with. Even though all these people that I knew from different backgrounds, I kind of knew them as people and kind of respected them as people. And I think also at this stage, the question also arose for me of, why are there all these different manifestations of the Christian faith? Is it just that, some people with a certain temperament, fit Quakerism? If you have a certain temperament, you go to the Anglican Church. And so I was beginning to ask questions about this, and where had all these different branches of the church come from? So that led in particular to reading a lot about church history, trying to understand at what stage different groups had appeared and why. And I think the conclusion I came to then was that, at different periods in history, the Holy Spirit had kind of, tried to restore some particular aspect to the church that had been missing. I think that's what the conclusion I came to at that time. So, at a time when there hadn't been much emphasis on the Holy Spirit and the gifts of the Holy Spirit, then Pentecostalism had arisen, and at a time when perhaps there hadn't been a lot of, emphasis on personal Bible reading, then evangelicalism had arisen. That was the kind of thinking I had at that stage. Whilst I was at university, there were perhaps two other aspects of life which in a way played quite a role in my future. One was that I got involved in different kinds of mission. I spoke French because I was studying French, so I went with various groups doing street evangelism in France, and we would sing on the streets with guitars and do street drama and talk to people in the streets. Another thing was that as I was gradually learning Russian at the time, I got involved with Open Doors, which is also another evangelical mission, which particularly at that time was supplying literature this is kind of mid-80s. So it was still the Soviet Union, and we were helping to supply Christian literature to Russia. Another thing that happened at this time was that I actually had the opportunity to go to Russia as part of my studies, and to study in St. Petersburg only for a month. But some of the other students who I was with one Sunday said to me, would you like to go with us? We're going to church at the Alexander Nevsky Lavra, which at the time would have been one of the few churches that was open in St. Petersburg, possibly the only one, I'm not quite sure. But it's a very large monastery right in the center of St. Petersburg on Nevsky Prospect. And so I decided to go along with them, and this really was the first time that I'd been at an Orthodox service of any kind. And I just remember that it was just packed out. I think at the time with although many of the churches were closed, and so to actually go to church on a Sunday, you had to kind of battle through the crowds of people wanting to be there too. But the thing that most struck me was the music. Again, coming from a musical background, suddenly I was kind of hit by this kind of wall of sound, I remember, and just everybody really joining in this service kind of physically, through crossing themselves, through bowing, through joining in with some of the singing. And I just had this amazing sense of God's presence in this place. So in a way, that was my first kind of living experience of Orthodoxy, and which was very positive. Obviously, it didn't really mean that I knew much about Orthodoxy at the time. And that really came during the year after I finished my studies at Durham. I moved to Bath to do a postgraduate course, and in Bath there is the Orthodox parish of St. John of Kronstadt, and I can see that several members of the parish are with us today. And this also was a very kind of key step forward in learning more about Orthodoxy. The parish worships on the whole in the English language, so it means that people like me could see that you didn't actually have to be Russian or Greek to be Orthodox, which was also a kind of major step forward, I think, in my thinking at that time. I didn't go regularly there. I just attended occasionally. I was attending an evangelical Anglican parish. By this time, in a way, I had got over my kind of fear of liturgical prayer, I think. In many ways, visiting the parish of St. John of Kronstadt, it raised many issues for me that I think are kind of stumbling blocks for many evangelicals when they encounter Orthodox worship. Just things like, people are kissing the icons, crossing themselves. At first, in particular, I thought there were these very kind of long and monotonous services, and I didn't know how to really engage with this service. Obviously, there's the liturgical structure of the services, which was, it was kind of growing on me, I think, through my knowledge of Anglicanism at that time, but I still found it kind of quite, not exactly alien, but certainly I didn't feel too at home with it. Obviously, theologically, I also had many questions, and I'm sure questions that many of you will be familiar with, questions like, venerating the saints, venerating the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, relics, venerating relics. Obviously, as somebody of evangelical background who'd spent a lot of my teens reading the Bible. There was the whole place of the scriptures within the Orthodox tradition. I wasn't used to there being priests. And obviously the whole central importance of the sacraments, and particularly, even Holy Communion and confession. Confession obviously was something completely new, but even the importance, the centrality of Holy Communion was something kind of still fairly alien for me as somebody coming from a largely non-conformist background. So it took a long time really for me to discuss many of these questions, to kind of read about things, to talk about them with people, but particularly at the parish of St. John of Kronstadt. And I'm very grateful to the different ways that people explain things to me over the years. Perhaps just one or two examples of, this is all kind of quite brief. And I'm aware that there are kind of deeper theological issues that people may want to go into, but I can just remember one time, I think I was on a kind of excursion, and we were being shown the iconostasis in the church, and the member of the parish who was explaining the iconostasis and the saints on the iconostasis, she said, well, we have the icons here and the iconostasis because we believe in the resurrection. And of course, somebody coming from an evangelical background, I thought, well, of course I believe in the resurrection too. But she said, well, we believe that these people are alive. They're still alive, and that was, I think, also kind of hit me, I think, for the first time. And this sense of, Orthodox worship, being a kind of, joining the worship that is going on continually in heaven. So I think that's what she put across in a very strong way, and that really kind of helped me in many ways to kind of understand why the presence of the saints and the icons in the church. I think similarly with the question of the place of Mary, which I think is perhaps a big issue for many evangelicals. I think also, that different people pointed out to me, well, our veneration of Mary is one aspect of our belief and our firm belief in the incarnation of Christ, that, Christ took flesh through the Mother of God, through Mary. And so on the one hand, she's somebody extremely special that God kind of chose for that particular role. In another way, kind of physically, for those 9 months, God was living within her. So, and in that sense, she's a kind of particularly kind of sanctified, sanctified body, sanctified person, but particularly her body. So, these are obviously kind of quite, simple ways of looking at things, and there's a lot of kind of theology there, which I could go into, but there isn't time now. I think one of the main things that kind of helped me to kind of overcome my evangelical kind of reserves about Orthodoxy was getting to know Orthodox liturgical texts. I'm particularly grateful that at Bath they allowed me to sing in the choir. And as a result, I began to see that so much of Orthodox worship is actually, is either literally scriptural texts, or it is commentaries on scripture, which are drawn from the early Christian fathers. So there's a great kind of wealth of understanding of scripture just within the actual texts of the church. And I think that gradually, beginning to understand the texts of the whole of the liturgical year, which takes you gradually through all the events of the life of Christ and then the key moments in the history of salvation. So, Pentecost and St. Peter and St. Paul, that is the feast that we had here yesterday. So in a way, rather than, they're not being the scriptures, in a way, I found a kind of a depth and a kind of balance and a wholeness of understanding scripture through worship. And then, through the fact that every year you're kind of, taken through this event again and actually given the chance to live through it again. And particularly at the time, I often thought that, in many of the evangelical backgrounds I'd been in, often the teaching or the kind of content of the service would often just depend on kind of what particular thing the preacher was interested in at that time. Whereas here, it's like, there was an opportunity for kind of a balanced review of and living through all the events of Christ's life each year. And I think it wasn't just that, but also there were some events that I felt had been completely missed out of my evangelical background. For example, a whole feast day devoted to Christ's circumcision or the transfiguration. I don't remember attending many evangelical Bible studies where we really talked about the transfiguration and its meaning for Christian theology as a whole, but also for our own kind of spirituality. It may just have been I was in the wrong place, but particularly the Transfiguration, Feast of the Transfiguration was something kind of very new for me, and all the texts of the Transfiguration just opened up the scriptures I found in a way that I'd never really seen before. So obviously it still took me a long time to get through all of that. I've put it in about 5 minutes here, but it was kind of 10 years really of kind of thinking and hesitating, and it was still a kind of big step. And I know that Rolf asked me before we kind of met for this particular meeting, he asked me, why did I eventually become Orthodox, rather than staying in my kind of previous background. And I was thinking about this, that perhaps there are two things in particular, although there are many reasons over the years, but I think one is particularly of Orthodox worship and life as a kind of holistic, spiritual and kind of bodily experience. This whole kind of multi-sensory aspect of Orthodox worship, of music, a kind of visuality and bodily contact with the icons, the use of physical things, that the consecration of physical elements like bread, and fruit, transfiguration of honey. My husband is a honey producer, a beekeeper, and so we take the honey for consecration in a couple of weeks at the beginning of August. So this sense of the whole earth being kind of affected by Christ and kind of being sanctified and saved by Christ. Not just kind of me personally, as had been the emphasis in my evangelical days. Obviously the whole aspect of fasting as prayer and repentance before the great feast days, that was another important aspect of this kind of Orthodox worship as a holistic kind of spiritual and bodily experience. And I think perhaps the other aspect of Orthodoxy, which obviously is all related to this, but sense of joining a Christian tradition which goes back over 2,000 years, and with all the kind of years of accumulated wisdom over the years. I've talked about the church texts, but also the whole ascetic tradition and ascetic writings, which I feel are, give a kind of insight into the human heart and soul, such as, I certainly hadn't encountered before I became Orthodox. In many ways, perhaps my final decision to become Orthodox was also linked up with what I was actually doing. There was all this kind of inner questioning and struggle, but alongside all of this, I was actually working in different ways. After my year in Bath, I I went to work at an organization called Aid to Russian Christians. It was the very final years of the USSR, and Aid to Russian Christians was sending Christian literature of different forms and also sending humanitarian aid to prisoners of conscience. So people that were Christians at the time who were in prison for their beliefs. So we sought to kind of raise awareness of that. And then as the Soviet Union opened up, despite all my kind of knowledge of Orthodoxy, I was still an evangelical, and so I went actually to work with Campus Crusade for Christ as Russia was opening up in the early 90s, and was working with students at Moscow State University. And in a way, this kind of led to I don't know, I mean, it didn't exactly force the decision on me, but it kind of showed me where I was in many ways, in that the students I was working with, many of whom had just come to faith, really through our kind of evangelism and Bible studies that we were holding. I kind of felt at home in Orthodox worship rather than the evangelical worship that there was in Moscow. And also I just felt more at home taking our Russian students to Orthodox worship. And this kind of led to a crisis really with the leadership of Campus Crusade eventually, although I had a very, very understanding team leader who did all he could to kind of keep me there. But in the end, it was kind of apparent that I was kind of working in a different direction. And in a way, it also was a kind of personal issue for me as well, you know, where I stood in relationship to Orthodoxy. And so at that stage, really, I eventually left Campus Crusade and I became Orthodox. That didn't kind of exactly lead me to Russia straight away. I stayed in Bath for a year or so and learned more about Orthodoxy. I also started studying at that stage at the St. Sergius Theological Institute, which at the time I think was the only place, really, this was kind of mid-90s, and it was the only place where you could study Orthodox theology. The Cambridge Institute hadn't opened then. And at the same time, although I was kind of happy to be in England and happy to have the opportunity to study theology, I was also aware that in the mid-90s, it's kind of like all the Russian churches were being rebuilt and opportunities were opening up again for Christian ministry in Russia. And obviously there was the issue of in what capacity I could go back. There weren't any kind of missions, as far as I knew, that I could go with that would support me as an Orthodox woman in particular. So in the end, I went back. I came as an English teacher. I'd got to know some English teachers from Russia, and they asked me to come and work in their school. So I came straight to Russia. In fact, I called in at Moscow to see my Moscow friends, and came to Russia. And at first I was teaching in school, but at the time I was still studying theology just by correspondence at the St. Sergius Institute. So I went once or sometimes twice, but on the whole just once a year to the St. Sergius Institute and studied on my own at a distance. And gradually that gave me the opportunity to be involved in a teaching ministry in the parish where I was here, and also in the prison ministry. In Czech Republic has a very active prison ministry, and I was asked to work with the women in our local prison here in Alate. So at first we went really just to pray with the women. They had a prayer room and we prayed with them, and then we actually opened up some kind of basic theology courses for some of them. A lot of them were quite educated. They were also young women with quite a desire to learn, some of them. So I got very involved with that. And then I was doing the same work really with adults in the parish here, in Alate, in the town itself. Also with my musical background, I ended up leading the choir in a newly opened parish. Obviously, a lot of parishes were being opened just at the time I was coming back. So I started to sing and then eventually led the choir. And then I found that, as I've already explained, that, you know, I find the liturgical texts of the Orthodox Church are full of biblical content. And so a lot of my catechizing was done through song and just through learning the church hymns with people and explaining the words and looking at icons together, and then looking at the biblical passages on which the church texts were based. So I started using that kind of teaching methodology with adults, with young people, drawing quite a lot of young people to sing as well. And just at the moment, it's a kind of great joy for me, particularly over the summer, that the kind of young people who 15 years ago, they were kind of like 10-year-olds or early teens who wanted to sing in the choir. They're now young women on the whole. There were some young men, but it was mainly young women, and they're married and with young children, and some of them are still in Alate and singing, and some of them have moved to other places, but they come back over the summer to visit their families. And so that's a great joy that they're still in the church, and they're still, you know, with a kind of love for God and a desire to grow in faith, I think through that, and through the input they had as teenagers. So that's kind of what I've been doing. So there you are. I think that
was I think one of the world's easiest interviews.
Yes, I haven't given you any opportunity to ask the question.
I was working down my list of points that I made, and you moved beautifully from one to the next without me needing to say anything at all. So yeah, that was wonderful. And I think, you know, there's lots of ways to reflect on that, but I think under our broad heading of journeys, what you've described is a fascinating and enriching journey of faith. And with lots of positive reasons for moving and turning in certain directions, and I think that's something that's really important to sort of draw on, isn't it? That it hasn't come necessarily out of a moment of crisis of faith, although I'm sure those moments happened. But there seems a natural progression from where you started and the nurturing that was given you in different ways when you were very young, and then through to where you are and the community that you're part of. I'm just thank you very much for sharing that story and the components that have brought you to where you are. I wonder, Mark, are you able to sort of kick us off in another direction for a bit? Thank you again.
Thank you, Alison, for that wonderful story. And as Ralph just said, I was listening to it as a journey with three dimensions to it, really. A spiritual journey, a very personal journey as well, and of course a geographical journey, because you've traveled in your life from one part of Europe to another. Well, maybe you're slightly beyond Europe. I don't know whether you class yourself as Europe or Asia where you are, but
Well, we're still this side of the Urals.
Yes.
I mean, yeah.
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 And thank you, Ralph, for doing the work of preparation on that, and for keeping quiet while Alison answered all your questions. So, so now it's opportunities for the rest of us to join the conversation. Perhaps first of all, we start by an opportunity for people to ask Alison any more questions, amplification, comment on what she's said. And I'm looking for raised hands. If you haven't found it yet, there's at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says reactions. And if you click on that, there's a bar at the bottom of it that says raise hand. So if you'd like to do that, please do that. I don't see any raised hands at the moment. So please be thinking what you'd like to ask about that. While we wait for, I was going to butt in with a question, but no, I'm going to let Jim speak. He's just raised a hand. Jim, the floor is yours.
Actually, the raised hand button mark on my screen is on participants. That's all I wanted to say initially.
Oh, right.
And so you'll be looking in vain at the reaction button. But let me just say, as long as I'm unmuted, Alison, thank you so much. I really appreciate everything you've said about your journey. I resonate with so much of what you said about tradition. And I'm actually teaching adult Sunday school at our church, an evangelical church. And I'm going to be talking about Theotokos on Sunday and why this is an evangelical point of view, not a only an Orthodox point of view. So thank you very much, and God bless you on your continued journey. We're all on a journey to find out more. I don't think any of us yet have, well, I don't know, maybe Mark or Tim have, but arrived at complete understanding. But I certainly haven't, and I'm working toward that. So God bless you on that journey. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Can I just respond to that and just say thank you for your book on mission, which obviously has been a very important part of my journey as well, because obviously the whole issue of mission within the Orthodox Church has been very important for me as I've gone along, in particular as I became Orthodox, with a kind of heart for mission. And your book is a great encouragement, I think, to all of those of us who are Orthodox. So thank you. It's good to meet you after many years of reading your book.
I'm waiting for more hands to be raised. There's plenty to talk about. Alison, while we wait for that, one thing I just wanted to ask you about was what seemed to be quite key in your story was communities. You spoke very warmly about the community in Bath, and then about other aspects of community, and in a different sense about the spiritual community of those who have lived before us and gone before us and are still alive with Christ. I don't know if you want to say anything about that might be a reflection on, I don't want to say the absence of community in evangelical circles, but what do you feel Orthodoxy has to say to evangelicals about community?
Yes, that's a really wonderful question, and it's something that I've thought about a lot. And it reminds me really of, in fact, when I took one of my exams at Saint-Serge, the question was particularly about the Sunday liturgy and the aspects of community within the liturgy. And obviously at many levels, obviously community is built into Orthodoxy, and in many ways it's the kind of individualism, not just of evangelicalism, but I think just of Western life on the whole, is is perhaps a reason why Orthodoxy is attractive, I think, for people in the West. And obviously, at one level, there's the very strong emphasis in the Sunday liturgy, which obviously is the core of worship within Orthodoxy, of communion and of kind of celebrating the fact that we are the body of Christ together. I think at another level, obviously there are particular theologians, I think, within Orthodoxy who have particularly drawn attention to this whole aspect of the fact that we are kind of communal beings. I mean, I would think of people like Bishop, is it John Zizioulas, and kind of being as communion. So I also think, say, of St. Silouan and the saying that your brother is your life. I often think of that saying that, in a way, it's through our love for our brother, but also through and our sister, but also through the kind of conflicts that arise and that we have to learn to overcome. That we grow and are saved, if you like. So this idea of that we become more fully human through our relationships with others. So I mean, perhaps if I'd kind of carried on more within evangelicalism, I think I know evangelicalism isn't a kind of set way of doing things, and I have friends within the Protestant churches who've read Zizioulas's books and and found them just wonderful, and have so I'm sure all that way of thinking has also been affecting the Western churches and the Protestant churches. But I think there is this kind of sense of worship, and of that we one reason that there is liturgical prayer, in a way, is that we pray together within Orthodoxy. I mean, it's not just, obviously we can say at any time a prayer on your own, and you can use your own words, but this sense of using prayers that not only do we say them together, but they're prayers that have been passed down through the communion of saints and all who have gone before us. Yes, so I think there is an awful lot that the evangelical world can learn about community from. On the other hand, I would say that there are also perhaps negative aspects of community within Orthodoxy. I would think, I mean, perhaps I shouldn't be starting to look at too many negative things, but I think living here within Russia as an English woman, I often feel that I am to a certain extent excluded from the church community simply by not being the right, I'm not ethnic Russian. So also within Orthodoxy, I think there are, aspects of community, of kind of ethnic community, and the very strong emphasis on linking Orthodoxy with your ethnos, that can lead to, the exclusion of some people. So, I think it's not all just good things to learn.
Yeah.
There are problems to learn from as well.
Thank you very much. The number of hands now gone up. I think probably, I think Tim had his hand up first, then Valentine, and then we have Brad and Father Eve after that. Tim.
Yeah. Alison, in my experience, a number of people who've moved from one tradition to the other, either way, Orthodox to evangelical or evangelical to Orthodox, have often been quite negative in how they've expressed themselves regarding the tradition where they started from. I found it quite interesting and encouraging that didn't come across in what you said. how would you feel now about your experience of the evangelical tradition? And obviously, you know, it is personal to you because the tradition does vary so widely. How would you sum up your attitude towards your experience, your background?
I think I have gone through different stages. I think when I was initially Orthodox, I mean, I wouldn't say I was really negative towards evangelicalism. I think some of the people who helped me along the way and were very kind of understanding, these are people, you know, in my evangelical background, understanding of the fact that I had kind of moved in a different direction, that certainly meant that I couldn't be negative to them as people. I think of my team leader in Campus Crusade for Christ, who since then his own son has become Orthodox, and that has been, you know, I think for him as a kind of evangelical leader has been a huge, perhaps not a huge crisis, but he certainly did everything possible to try to understand what I was going through. I also think of another, I don't know if he's with us at the moment, I know he wanted to be, the man who was the pastor of the United Reformed Church that I attended in Durham, and who has had his own kind of journey in a way, I think, from being United Reformed to a more kind of Catholic faith. I remember him just ringing up when he heard that I'd decided to become Orthodox, and I mean, at the time he was still a Protestant, I think, and just saying to me, you know, we're with you in this, you know, and so it was very moving. And, you know, members of my own family who are in the Anglican Church now, or certainly in Protestant traditions, you know, they attended my chrismation when I became Orthodox, and I was very keen for them to do that. That I wanted them to kind of see that it wasn't just me becoming kind of Russian in a way, that it was kind of very much part of, you know, my whole life. And so in that way, I've never really found I could be negative. I mean, there are certain aspects perhaps of evangelicalism which today I would find difficult, but I can still nevertheless recognize that the people I've known, and, you know, and I'm sure any kind of evangelical, that there is a kind of a genuine faith there in God, and a genuine knowledge of God. And obviously it will depend on the person, so I would say that of, you know, people of any Christian background, or, you know, of any kind of faith background really today. I think in particular, I often think of one of the key prayers of Orthodoxy, the prayer to the Holy Spirit, which says, you know, is addressing the Holy Spirit and says, you know, is everywhere present and fillest all things. So, you know, I have this kind of, I think within Orthodoxy there is this very strong sense of the presence of the Holy Spirit, and obviously there is the image of God in each person. So, you know, regardless of what background we're from, I think you can always respect that. Yeah, so I think that's, you know, where I stand at the moment. I mean, when I'm back in England, I attend Anglican services. I've attended other types of services, you know, Lutheran services when I was in Estonia. Yeah, and, you know, God is there. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't differences, but anyway, yeah, as I've said.
Thank you, Alison. Let's we've got several hands up now, so let's move on to Valentin.
Yes, thank you, Alison. It was most interesting for me to learn part of your story, because I also have similar story. but from another direction, from the Orthodoxy to evangelicalism and then back to Orthodoxy. But on more personal note, Alison, what was the response of your family? I mean, your closest family members or your wider family, and also your friends, to this huge move in your life. So how much understanding they were or still are? Or did you get any comments or any suggestions when you speak to them, when you see them, even today? So what was their reaction to your family and your friends to this huge move in your life?
Yeah. Well, as I've just mentioned, there were particular people who really went out of their way to show support and understanding. I think there were people, obviously, that found it difficult. And they asked me a lot of questions. I mean, I don't think I ever had any really kind of negative or real kind of strong conflicts with anybody. But there certainly were people who kind of made it clear that, certain aspects of Orthodoxy they just found completely strange and unacceptable. I mean, I think, I mean, as I've explained, when I became Orthodox at my chrismation, some people from the Anglican parish I was at, they came to my chrismation, and several members of my family came as well, so that they could kind of see what was going on. So I wouldn't say, it's really been, perhaps one of the people who's found it hardest has been my own father, who is not, would say that he's not a believer at all. And I think for him, he kind of felt it was just going into something completely kind of medieval. But, he can't really accept any of the Christian traditions. So, yeah.
Thank you, Alison. Brad, Nassif, you're next. If you could unmute.
Thank you, Alison. It's a joy to hear your story, and I was delighted to hear especially one part of it that I wanted to share something with you that might be of interest to you. Back in 1992, I was invited to go with the Campus Crusade for Christ Jesus mission, and where they went to Moscow and other places to show the Jesus film. And on my way over to Russia, I was invited to have a meeting with Bill Bright, believe it or not. And here is a letter that Bill Bright actually wrote about Campus Crusade and about his attitude toward the Orthodox. He's, of course, since passed away. I thought I'd read just a portion of it. April 20th, 1992. Dear Dr. Nassif, Campus Crusade for Christ has always sought to develop good relationships with our brothers in Christ all over the world. I am glad to join your Society for the Study of Eastern Orthodoxy and Evangelicalism. I believe this will lead to fruitful dialogue and cooperative relations between Christians, and thus will better serve the cause of Christ. We are especially desirous of developing an ongoing common witness with the Russian Orthodox Church and to explore ways to improve relations with them. We appreciate Dr. Nassif's leadership in this matter for the cause of Christian unity, yours for fulfilling the Great Commission. In this generation, Bill Bright. So there you go. So there you have somebody from Campus Crusade who is very desirous of building bridges between the Russian Church and evangelicals. I thought I'd just share that with you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very interested to hear about that letter. I mean, in my own experience, there were kind of different strands, depending on what people's background were and their practical experience of working with Orthodox. I think the Bath Orthodox community will remember quite well that there was a team of Campus Crusade, which was mainly made up of people of European background, that was based in Bath for several years, and they developed quite a strong friendship with the Bath Orthodox community, and they certainly sought to understand Orthodoxy, and many of the contacts that they were working with in Russia, they were helped. This is right kind of end of the 80s and early 90s, and they were helping people who were Orthodox with writing literature, publishing literature. I mean, things were just beginning to open up in Russia, and there was the possibility of publishing literature. And I know that this particular team of Campus Crusade that was based in Bath, and that I also worked with for a year or two before I went to Moscow. They had a very positive view of Orthodoxy. I did find things quite different when I actually got to Moscow and was on the ground in Moscow. I mean, there may have been a kind of desire to work together, but I think that I met very little really among the people I worked with in Moscow, very little kind of desire to really understand Orthodoxy in a way that I felt that the team in Bath had tried to understand Orthodoxy and work together with Orthodox believers. And so they'd set up a separate evangelical church in Moscow, and the students that we were working with, on the whole, we were encouraged to take students to this kind of newly founded. It wasn't even, the kind of Russian evangelical church, or a kind of Russian Baptist or evangelical church. It was a kind of new evangelical church set up specially for students who came to faith through the mission of the Campus Crusade mission in Moscow.
I took this letter to the Moscow Patriarchate. Father John Meyendorf happened to be in Moscow in 1992, and it gave me an introduction to the Department of External Relations. And I talked with the man in charge there. He seemed to be very kind and very godly, and so I showed him the letter, and I talked to him about how there might be ways for us to build bridges, and he was very reassuring. Yes, this is what we should do, and I look forward to working with you. And I came home and I never heard a word again. That's as far as it went. Later I found out he was a plant from the KGB. So it never got off the ground.
Yeah.
Those were the realities back in 1992.
Yes, and I would say that in many ways things were probably more open in 1992. I think by the end of the 90s, the Russian Church on the whole had just felt completely kind of, invaded by all the Protestant missionaries in the 90s, and much more kind of negative attitude and lack of willingness to work together with people of Protestant background, I think, set in.
Thank you. Well, all this mention of Bath, Father Eve, we must draw you in. It's lovely to see you here. I think the last time I met you was when, rather like Alison, I came to visit in Bath in the mid-90s. I can't remember when it was, but lovely. It's lovely to have you on the screen.
Yes, different in those days. All I want to say simply that Rowan Williams has just published what I consider to be an absolutely major book of Orthodox theology in depth. And he makes, towards the end of the book, when he talks about Mother Maria Skoptsova, he makes the point that it's not even just a question of Orthodox or evangelical. He takes it much more that it's become culturally a major aspect of our whole Western culture that, for instance, our empathy with those who suffer, are doing something for other people, is seen through our Western eye as our personal initiative. We see our Christian life always as my initiative towards Christ, towards other people, and so forth. And what Rowan Williams says, that if you really enter very deeply, like Mother Maria Skoptsova, in an Orthodox sensitivity, that isn't there. It's God's initiative. It's God who plunges us through baptism into a situation where Christ has taken the step towards the whole human race, and it's just because Christ has taken us into himself that we find ourselves at one with all human beings, not because we've chosen, but because Christ has taken that initiative, has taken that step. And of course, as individual Orthodox Christians, we've got to try to get away from it's me doing something for God, it's me choosing Christ, it's me developing empathy with other human beings, to let go of that and say Christ has become a human being, and Christ has taken the initiative of including me in his being, and therefore I have no choice but love all people and experience their suffering and what they're going through. I think that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Father, for sharing that. And if you haven't noticed, Ralph has very quickly put up the, he's not advertising Amazon, but rather Rowan Williams. He's put it in the chat. Nikos, great to see you again, and your time on the screen.
Thank you. It's a pleasure seeing friends from Finland and from other meetings as well. I have to say that today in the Orthodox Church we commemorate one of the very few new canonized saints who has an ecumenical aspect in his life. He is the martyr of the White Rose movement in Munich, the anti-Nazi movement, Alexander Smorel. And I'm mentioning Alexander Smorel because often when we speak about conversion, and I'm not an expert in the psychology of conversion, but we always discuss whether conversion is a conversion to Christ or it's a conversion to the church. And if you see in the Orthodox context, for example, Alison said that she was received simply by chrismation, but this is not the universal praxis within the Orthodox Church. When I came to the Orthodox Church, I was received just by confession, not even chrismation, but others would also request even baptism. And this variety of different pastoral ways, I wouldn't really call them different pastoral approaches, but a chaos of how we understand the church, conversion, the theology of conversion, and eventually how we understand all the other churches and church families that exist. Perhaps you're aware that during the Holy Greek Council of Crete in 2016, there was a strong debate, even if it was possible to mention the existence of other churches as churches in the documents of the council. And eventually, the church fathers decided that we will accept the historical existence of the name churches. And for me, this is really, I will say it publicly, a ridiculous approach, a theological approach, to come to a conclusion after so many decades of ecumenical dialogue that we will accept just the historical name churches for the sake of continuing the council. I'm happy for Alison that she was received just by chrismation, and I'm very sad for many other friends who converted to the Orthodox Church and who received a second or even a third baptism again and again and again in order to become fully converted, not to Christ, but to the Orthodox Church, if not a national church. So it would be very interesting, I think, for the initiative on the future to look on these ways of receiving believers from the other churches. And through that, we will understand the problematic aspect of conversion within our churches, not just between one church to another, but even the different ways the national churches, for example, the Orthodox churches, are using to receive people from other denominations and church families. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos. I think you've opened up a whole area there we perhaps need a whole session on. I just need to clarify, Jim Stimulus' hand is still up. Is that left up from before, or are you wishing to speak again? Because you're next if you are wanting to speak again.
No, my hand was up from before. I didn't know how to take it down. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
Get it taken down.
In which case, Evie, you're next. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. As far as the last comment made by Nikos, I'm also very happy to hear that Alison was received by chrismation, and of course this is a normal practice, but we are not all that normal all the time. There has been a situation where we have rebaptized the person coming from the Catholic Church that was already an ordained priest. We rebaptized him, but we did not reordain. So there are some peculiarities, some absurdities to say that it is not so very easy to resolve. And perhaps we are also, now comes a deconstruction. I mean, I was born in an Orthodox environment and I have the right to deconstruct. Because on the other hand, we are all Western people culturally as well, and we have many ties among each other. So we act also in an individualistic way many a time, or every simple priest thinks they are the Pope and that they convey an absolute truth within the church. Thank God, we also construct a new tradition through the ecumenical movement. And even if it is tricky when it comes to worship, when it comes to certain restrictions and boundaries, it is certainly easier when we share, for example, scholarship. For example, my biblical colleagues say that well, we have a lot more in common to our Protestant colleagues whose books we read all the time and we highly appreciate and we learn from, and they motivate us for our own research than some of other, namely Orthodox Christians, but who are very fundamentalist, or they are very influenced by, I would call it as it is, the white male supremacy movement of the US. And we have a vast inflow of such converts, and they come and claim that they know what Orthodoxy is about, and it is a kind of ultra-Protestantism they have in mind, and they want to reshape our tradition according to this alt-right, extreme right, peculiar vision of theirs of pure fundamentalism and conservatism. I, as a missiologist, because I'm a missiologist and always interested in ecumenical dialogue. In fact, ever since I was a child, I was an internationalist. I would see periodicals on mission where black children would be there, and I thought as a child, well, they are my siblings. God is for us all somewhere. This is why I always could not confine myself within the Greek boundaries. But of course, having some good intention it is quite different than trying to coexist, which presents actual difficulties and problems. But it is also difficult to coexist even within our communities. I mean, you stress the sense of community, but I feel very much the lack of community. Only in a very few parishes there is a community. There are some scarce conversions from Muslim people, and they don't know where to go. There is no receiving community, so they feel extremely isolated. And there is a lot of clericalism, and if you do not like this kind of power relations within a community, then even if you are born in that church, you may very well feel alienated. It's not just a question of nationality. But thank God, also as missiologists, and me in particular, I mean, when I read about mission, who am I going to read? Okay, I'm reading my father, who was professor of missiology. I'm reading Stamuilis, of course. I'm reading Yanulatos and a few others. But the great amount of literature that paves the way and shares long historical experience is Protestant or Catholic. And we need to acknowledge that and realize that we have different forms of unity nowadays beyond the boundaries of our church. On the other hand, we respect the historical situation that has to be concrete somehow. And there are people who cross over and there are people who remain as they are. For example, one big temptation of mine, because I was listening to what Mark was saying the other time, is that I'm very saddened that we stopped dialogue with the Anglicans because of women ordination. My personal feeling is that, I mean, if everything was theologically okay to that point, then maybe we have some sort of a problem of other kind to stop it because of that. And it's not like, and we have to question again our anthropological presuppositions and our theological basics. And life is open to what comes in the future. But of course, structures are not that open because it is a question of power. And that's what I wish to share. And thank you, Alison, very much. I mean, I've known you for a long while, but I've never known all this you shared with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. We have two more hands up. Actually, before I move to somebody else, if you're not speaking, if you could mute your microphones, because I think we're getting a little bit of feedback, interference from somewhere. So if you could mute if you're not speaking. I'm going to ask the next two people to be fairly brief, because I'd like to give Alison 5 minutes at the very end to come back with any responses you've got, Alison, to what's been said. But I'm going to ask Alexander to come next. You're waiting there.
Okay, thank you. This is a question for the Alison. You are coming from a non-conformist background, and being non-conformist is also a political kind of a position as well. So your conversion or transition from evangelical to Orthodox was also having some kind of political repercussion, because the Russian Church is obviously in a symphonic relationship with the state, and it's there is a very strong anti-Westernism present currently in the Russian Church. And I wonder, how did you deal with that kind of political shift as well?
Alison, I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about that. You probably need 2 hours to think about it, but Auda, could you just feed in you briefly any question or comment you have, and then we'll hand over to Alison for the last 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. I have a question and a little bit, it is a surprised one. Everybody is using the word conversion. Is changing a faith inside the Christian faith a conversion? Or it is changing something else? I can understand a conversion being from Christian to Muslim or Christian to Hebrew or to any other religion. But moving from one faith inside the Christianity to another, why we are calling it conversion first? And if any Protestant or Evangelical will come back to the original faith, Orthodoxy, is this also a conversion, or it's going back to the original faith which we all believe in? Let me introduce myself first. I am a Jordanian from Palestinian origin. I am an Orthodox. I am living in Amman, and I am involved in the ecumenical movement since more than 20 years. I am representing the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem at the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches, and I served as a member of the Executive Committee of the World Council of Churches, as well as on the Middle East Council of Churches. In profession, I am a general surgeon. I'm not a theologian, but since I am involved in my church and in lifting its capacities, especially in education, in both Jordan and Palestine, I am putting those questions. Thank you for the invitation, and I hope that I will answer hear the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Oda. I think we have two quite surgical questions for you, Alison, at the end there, and we may have to come back in future sessions to discuss those. But you have the last 5 minutes to respond and say anything you want to say.
Yes. Well, just to respond to our day's question. I don't use the word conversion really of my becoming Orthodox. I mean, I've in recent years kind of hesitate to use this word at all, actually. Not just of me, but I've spent a lot of the last few years researching the missionary movement here in the Mid-Volga and the Orthodox missionary movements among the Finno-Ugric and Turkic peoples of the Volga, and in the kind of scholarship connected with the conversions of these peoples. Well, I've used the word conversion, but they're kind of coming to Orthodoxy. There's a lot of debate about the nature of conversion, and obviously just generally in, I would say, not just theological scholarship, but in historical scholarship, looking at the Christianization of different peoples at different stages of history in different contexts. But I found quite a stress in recent scholarship of getting away from kind of conversion as an individual experience, and looking much more at the way whole peoples are gradually influenced by the Christian faith, and conversion is often just not the right term at all. I mean, I think the word conversion has tended to be used mainly of a kind of individual coming to faith in Christ, whereas obviously for many people it's not an appropriate way of looking at the way they have perhaps gradually become aware of God's presence in their life, or it's that they are part of a people who are kind of Christian by tradition, and so they've never really gone through what an evangelical might think of as a conversion experience, and yet can be very deeply Christian. So yes, I think the whole question of the use of the word conversion, you have to be very careful, both with using that word. To answer Alexander's question, and thank you for this question, and in many ways it's I think probably because I was a kind of nonconformist in my teens, I perhaps wasn't aware so much of the kind of perhaps the political sides of nonconformism, and I'm perhaps more aware of them now than I was then, and I think also probably in becoming Orthodox, I would say I probably was not as aware as I could have been of the whole relationship, the kind of symphonic relationship with the state that is the way that most Orthodox churches function. And I have to admit, it's been one of the kind of crisis issues for me in recent years. I would say in the kind of 90s and perhaps the early 2000s, I didn't find it such a kind of problem. Perhaps it's because of the type of Orthodox people that I was mixing with. Obviously, I became Orthodox through a community in Britain that is not particularly kind of, it's not, it isn't attached to one particular ethnic background. I was also introduced to Orthodoxy through, for example, the monastery of at Tolleshunt Knights, which has people of different ethnic backgrounds, and I think it is one of the very kind of strong aspects of Orthodoxy in the West that, you know, Orthodoxy has had a chance to kind of get away from this symphonic relationship with the state, and I have found it increasingly difficult. As I've already mentioned, really, as an English woman in the Russian Church, I think it might not be so difficult if I was in some of the more cosmopolitan or cosmopolitanly minded parishes or communities, for example, in Moscow. But where I am, there is a very strong strain of kind of relating Orthodoxy to ethnic identity, and I found this particularly difficult. It became particularly difficult at the time of the war in the Ukraine for me. I could hardly watch the news really during that time. It was so kind of anti-Western, and you know, and it's led me to having some quite serious conflicts with some of the local clergy. So I would say it's, you know, and I would say it's probably the biggest challenge to Orthodoxy in the present day.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah, and Orthodoxy, as it kind of spills out of its original kind of homelands and moves to the West. I mean, obviously, many communities, they carry on kind of attached to their ethnic roots, and kind of in a way, understandably so, in the diaspora. But you know, I think there needs to be a gradually kind of moving out of that kind of ethnic view of Orthodoxy towards a much more kind of view of Orthodoxy as, you know, the kind of the gospel of Christ, the gospel of love for neighbor, regardless of ethnicity.
Thank you, Alison, and that's a good note to finish on. Some of you might be interested to know that within the board of LOI, we have already been talking about sponsoring some sort of conversation around faith and nationalism. Because it's an issue not just for Orthodox, it's an issue for evangelicals in other different parts of the world, which I won't name at the moment, but it's very much so. Do keep an eye open. We are hoping to be sponsoring some face-to-face conferences in the future. We have plans to meet in Austria next year and also in Alaska. So keep in touch. We'll also be doing more online events like this, maybe one on this particular topic we just ended on faith and nationalism in the near future. So watch out for emails from us, and do write to us if you've got any particular thing you want to raise with us, any suggestions, any questions. Our email address, I'm sure Tim won't mind if I give this out, is very simple. It's lausanne.orthodox@gmail.com, and the website, as I think you know, is www.loi .net. Sorry, loimission.net. I knew I was getting it wrong. loimission.net. So thank you very much for joining us today. It's been lovely to have you with us, and I hope you found it useful yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.